Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for joining us. My name is Claire, and I'll be the librarian host this afternoon. This seminar series is offered through the NOAA Central Library Seminar Program, which provides an educational forum for the presentation of ideas, research updates, and news in support of NOAA's mission. We are excited to be hosting another in the series for the Weather Program Office. Before we start, I have a few technical tips for attendees. If you are muted and you are not able to, you are muted, but you are not able to unmute. However, if you have a question, you can type it in the question or chat panel, and we will get to those during the Q&A at the end of the presentation. If you have any audio or visual issues, if you can't hear the speaker or see the slides, please try logging off and logging back on. That solves most issues in GoToWebinar. As a reminder, this is being recorded. If you would like to revisit this seminar or view previous seminars, you can find them on our YouTube channel, and I'll place a link to that channel in the chat box momentarily. Now I'm going to turn it over to Gina, who's going to introduce our speakers today.
Thank you so much, Claire, and thank you so much for hosting this. Good afternoon or good morning to whoever is listening in from different time zones across the country, maybe even around the world, for the last in a four-part series. Thank you all so much for joining us. So as some of you may know, this opening will be a repeat of previous weeks, but if you are joining us new, I hope this will be informative. As some of you may know, the Weather Research and Forecasting Innovation Act of 2017 requires NOAA to prioritize research that improves forecasts and warnings for the protection of life, property, and the enhancement of the national economy. Specifically, Section 104 of the Weather Act, as well as the Bipartisan Budget Act of 2018, otherwise known as the Disaster Supplemental Appropriations, provided NOAA with a wonderfully unique and important opportunity to integrate the social, behavioral, and economic sciences into NOAA's tropical products, information, and services, and very importantly, incorporate risk communication research into the design and communication of its products. The Weather Program Office worked side by side, truly in tandem with the National Weather Service to fund 4 projects to reach our shared goals. And today's webinar is the 4th and final of this series to highlight this very important work. These projects in today's webinar would not be possible without a team, and as such, for the 4th and last time, although I'm sure not the last time for the life of these projects, I would like to publicly thank the NOAA Central Library for just being wonderful hosts, the National Weather Service, including Jennifer Sprague-Hildebrand, Jessica Schauer, Robbie Berg, and the entire Tropical Roadmap team, as well as Mickey Olson and Castle Williams from WPO for all their time and commitment to advancing social science research and operations, and of course, to all of our academic partners involved in these projects. With that, we are very excited to introduce Dr. Jamie Vickery, and this is a victory, but excuse me, Dr. Jamie Vickery, Dr. Ann Bostrom, and Dr. Rebecca Morse, whose project was also funded under the supplemental funding. By interviewing and surveying Weather Service partners, specifically emergency managers and broadcast meteorologists, this project can help the Weather Service prioritize their efforts to modernize their tropical cyclone product suite and identify gaps needed to enhance Weather Service partner decision making. With that, team, I believe it's Jamie, the floor is yours.
Great, thank you so much, Gina. And I think that I would much rather have the name Jamie Vickery. That would be a pretty cool name to have. But yes, hello everyone. As Gina mentioned, my name is Jamie Vickery, and I'm a visiting researcher at the National Center for Atmospheric Research and the research coordinator for the Collaborative on Extreme Event Resilience at the University of Washington. And today I'll be co-presenting with my colleague Ann Bostrom, who is a Weyerhaeuser Endowed Professor in Environmental Policy in the Evans School of Public Policy and Governance, also at the University of Washington. We are very grateful for the opportunity to present findings from our ongoing evaluation project funded by the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration titled Minding the Gap, Modernizing the TC Product Suite by Evaluating NWS Partner Information Needs. And throughout the presentation, I may alternate using TC and tropical cyclones since it's mentioned quite a bit. Despite the growing volume of forecast and warning information provided by the meteorological community when a tropical cyclone threatens the U.S., National Weather Service partners and other decision makers still experience major challenges in understanding and evaluating the risks posed by an approaching tropical cyclone and using available information to make protective decisions. To address the gap between information provision and use, this project is evaluating the National Weather Service Tropical Cyclone Product Suite with respect to how it meets key NWS partners' needs. And today we will present on interview findings from the project, as well as preliminary findings from online survey data with broadcast meteorologists. Next slide, Rebecca. Thank you. I'd like to acknowledge all of our team members listed here, starting with Rebecca Morse, who is the principal investigator for this study, Julie Demuth and Heather Lazarus at the National Center for Atmospheric Research, as well as our University of Washington team members, Ann Bostrom, who is co-presenting with me today, of course, and Nick Haji-Michael. A special thank you to our NOAA collaborators for their support and invaluable insights throughout the project, including Robbie Berg, Gina Esco, Frank Marks, Shirley Murillo, Mickey Olson, Jessica Schauer, Jennifer Sprague, and Castle Williams. This really has been a partnership from conception through designing and implementing the research methods and interpreting the results. So we thank you very much for this partnership. Next slide. For today's presentation, I will be providing a brief overview of the objectives of the Minding the Gap study, interview methods, and findings, and will then present the second half of the presentation, which includes an overview of the survey methods employed for this study, preliminary findings from an online survey with broadcast meteorologists, and next steps. In terms of how these methods were used in the study, interviews allowed us to gain in-depth information from a selected group of broadcast meteorologists and emergency managers. These are being followed by surveys of a larger sample of broadcast meteorologists and emergency managers to investigate findings from the interviews more broadly across tropical cyclone affected regions of the mainland US. These methods are complementary in nature in that the survey builds on findings from the interview data, and the in-depth data from the interviews are helping us understand some of the survey findings. Next slide. Oh, and I'd also like to note that our methods and findings are also deeply informed by past relevant research and interactions with NOAA and key advisors from the partner groups. The larger evaluation project is titled Minding the Gap, Modernizing the TC Product Suite by Evaluating NWS Partner Information Needs, and includes the following objectives: to create timelines for how key NWS partners use forecast information and make decisions as a TC threat evolves, to understand key NWS partners' TC information uses and needs leading up to a threat, to analyze key unmet decision makers' needs and identify gaps in the TC product suite, and finally, to develop research-guided recommendations to NOAA on improving the TC product suite broadly defined, focusing not on specific products, but on the collection of products, tools, and services that the NWS provides now and that could be provided based on future meteorology, social science, and interdisciplinary research. The first research phase of this project was to conduct semi-structured interviews with roughly 20 to 25 participants in order to gain a deeper understanding of their decisions and actions within the context of a tropical cyclone threat, as well as the utility of the current tropical cyclone product suite. We selected the geographical areas listed on the left-hand side of the table for data collection in collaboration with NOAA. These include Georgia, South Carolina, and Southeast Texas. We ultimately decided on these states and regions because they have coastlines as well as areas subject to inland flooding. Metro areas represented here included Houston, Charleston, Columbia, and Savannah, as well as surrounding rural and more inland areas. And before our interview timeline was cut short, we were able to conduct interviews with a total of 20 emergency managers and broadcast meteorologists in these areas, as you can see within the table shown here. These took place in February and early March of 2020, and we had planned to conduct several additional interviews in Texas and South Carolina and to extend our interview sample to a third region of the US, including New York and New Jersey. However, we stopped interview data collection in mid-March of 2020 because the rapidly evolving COVID-19 pandemic created difficulties for recruiting additional interviewees. Each interview was audio recorded and professionally transcribed for analysis. The guide we used to structure each of the interviews was divided into 3 sections. The first includes introductory questions that ask participants about their job roles and their experiences working during TC events or threats. The second section asks interviewees a series of questions about their decisions and actions during an evolving TC threat or event, in which we ask them to walk us through critical decision stages and what products and information sources they rely on to make decisions. And finally, we asked a set of questions having to do with specific tropical cyclone products, which I'll show in an upcoming slide here. In the third and final section of the guide, we asked interviewees about the utility and applicability of the 12 products represented here, which were decided upon through communication with and feedback from NOAA. Given the time constraints of our interviews, our aim was not to get in-depth feedback about each product, but rather to get feedback about the most useful information and areas for improvement regarding the tropical cyclone product suite as a whole. We provided pictures of each product listed here to interviewees, like the ones shown on the right, as visual aids for them as we went through this section of the guide. We used in vivo qualitative analysis software to systematically analyze interviews to capture themes and information pertaining to the project objectives. We did so by using a coding scheme that helps us mark excerpts from the interviews where they talked about different concepts of interest. We then examined data within different codes to analyze different themes across the perspectives provided by individual interviewees. And so here we have a few examples of codes represented in our scheme. The higher level codes, such as decisions and actions, forecast information, and TC timeframe, contain subcodes that are shown here that we assigned to specific areas of text. For each of these, we also had definitions and coding instructions as part of our interview codebook on the next slide. While some of these codes were more subjective in nature, this was a way for members of the research team to have an agreed upon and common understanding of key codes as we applied them to the data for analysis. Importantly, we revised the codebook multiple times to integrate project-driven objectives with data-driven insights. And today we will show overarching results analyzed across the interview data. So what we present next has been, as I mentioned, thematically analyzed using an adjudicated coding scheme and in vivo qualitative analysis software for us to capture key overarching themes about decisions and actions and information uses and needs for each stakeholder partner group. These are highlights from our data analysis, and we have more in-depth reports and publication, including a manuscript upcoming on the interviews that we anticipate finalizing soon. To present our findings on how broadcast meteorologists and emergency managers' decisions and information use evolve, we'll talk about 3 phases of a tropical cyclone threat shown here. We identified these 3 phases based on relevant literature, discussions with NOAA, and our interview pre-tests, and then refined them through the interview and analysis process. These phases are not distinct, rather they overlap, and the specific timeframes associated with each phase depends to some extent on the storm and decision maker, but we found them useful in conducting the interviews and interpreting the results. The first phase, shown on the left here, corresponds to the time frame when a specific tropical cyclone forms or is forming, but when there is still significant uncertainty about whether it will affect the US, and if so, where and how. Depending on the storm, this phase can be short or it can last for many days. And during this phase, given the forecast uncertainties, broadcast meteorologists and emergency managers are typically focusing on monitoring the threat and building awareness. With today's forecast skill, the second phase typically begins about 5 days before tropical cyclone impacts, when a threat to the US is more likely. As this phase continues, the forecasts narrow down to more specific regions at risk and then more specific possible impacts. This phase is when communication about the threat ramps up and when most protective decisions affecting large populations must be made in order for it to be possible to implement these protective actions safely before tropical storm force winds arrive. The third phase begins about 48 hours before tropical cyclone impacts, when forecasters can typically provide more specific information about what weather-related hazards and impacts different areas are likely to experience. Currently, this phase is the time frame when the NWS issues tropical cyclone-related watches and warnings. As impacts approach, this phase shifts from focusing on forecasts to people beginning to observe and experience the storm's impacts. Corresponding to this also indicates transitions from pre-event decisions to during-event actions and response. To provide a high-level overview, these are the major types of decisions that we found that members of each group make and the actions they take during a tropical cyclone threat. We will focus on how these evolve with the tropical cyclone threat during different phases throughout the upcoming slides. And throughout the timeline, broadcast meteorologists' activities and decisions can be categorized as information gathering and interpretation, communication and engagement with public audiences across multiple media platforms, and communication and preparation within their organization. For emergency managers, key decision and actions include information gathering and interpretation. This includes communication with the NWS, communication, coordination, and advisement within their organization and with local, regional, and state partners, communication with media and members of the public, as well as evacuation and resource staging. So again, what we'll be presenting here, these are highlights, and some activities definitely do depend on the level of threat for the broadcast meteorologist area of coverage. But starting with phase 1, from initial awareness of a tropical cyclone threat to roughly 5 days before landfall or impacts, broadcast meteorologists that we interviewed shared that they are tracking any disturbances and monitoring storm behavior and tropical cyclone formation. This involves paying close attention to modeling trends, both over time and across sources and products, as well as comparing interpretations of these modeling trends. Throughout the entire timeline, broadcast meteorologists are telling viewers how to prepare, get to a safe place if the threat becomes more imminent, and telling them to remain aware. Though at this point, they will only be communicating a potential threat if it's likely to affect their area or region. Broadcast meteorologists will be starting discussions with station leadership and their weather teams. They'll begin initial engagements with NWS offices and the National Hurricane Center, as well as monitoring social media for misinformation. If they see misinformation spreading, that will then determine what they share on air through their communication channels to try to combat this misinformation that's coming out. In phase 2, at 5 days to 48 hours from impacts or landfall, broadcast meteorologists shared that they are moving into the action phase, so to speak. They are continuing to gather official information, comparing their own model findings to make sure that they're aligned. However, the broadcast meteorologists that we met with shared that they won't contradict official sources from the NWS or the National Hurricane Center. They are aiming for consistency in information shared across shifts, across stations, and so forth. Actions that began in that previous phase substantially increased, such as internal communication through station-wide meetings and what they share on air about the threat to viewers. However, at this point, they will be talking through or sharing localized potential impacts as much as possible, providing regional or even county-by-county breakdowns to viewers as the threat approaches. From this time frame on, they will be communicating official information from local, county, or state leadership in real time, airing press conferences about evacuation or pre-evacuations, for example. And in the final phase, as one interviewee put it, this is their Super Bowl in terms of the hours leading up to a threat. Broadcast meteorologists are increasingly using observational data to share updates with viewership and relying less on model output to communicate risk and track the impacts of the storm as it moves closer. And at that point, while there is still uncertainty, they're able to communicate more localized impacts. They'll continue to consult with NWS and the National Hurricane Center through webinars, briefings, and NWS chat. And at this point, broadcast meteorologists shared that they are moving into increased coverage in the form of cut-ins or wall-to-wall coverage. Importantly, interviewees explained that especially during this time frame, family and staff safety are their priority. If reporters are deployed, they will work to make sure that they are in a safe location. And since it would have been a little messy to overlap information used onto the decision and action timeline, we decided to break this out in a table that, by column, shows the 3 timeframes to portray progression of information used over time. Some of these types of information were mentioned more commonly than others, and we are collecting data in the survey to develop a more complete understanding of the usefulness of different types of information across a broader sample of broadcast meteorologists. The information is organized into formal National Weather Service tropical cyclone products, other information from the NWS, modeling, and other sources, including observational data and private companies. As we found from the interview data, broadcast meteorologists use products and information to make decisions about media coverage, since that is the primary focus of their job role. Therefore, their decisions largely are driven by the availability of information. And this, again, just provides an overview of what broadcast meteorologists frequently reference. At roughly 5 days out, for instance, all broadcast meteorologist interviewees shared that they use the 5-day graphical tropical weather outlook for monitoring and tracking a potential threat, and they compared GFS, Canadian, European, and spaghetti models to determine if and how the models were aligning to pick up on trends. In the next time frame, all broadcast meteorologists referenced the cone of uncertainty for their own awareness and how they use this to illustrate the potential threat to viewers. One example of how information use evolves with a threat is that, as I mentioned previously, as the storm approaches, broadcast meteorologists have more types of observations available and increasingly rely on those data to share information and updates with viewers as the timeline progresses. And again, this is meant to be more of a high-level overview since we can't get too much into detail today, but more information will be provided in upcoming manuscripts and write-ups. As with broadcast meteorologists, these are highlights, and some activities depend on the level of threat for the emergency manager's area of coverage. And so moving into this decision action timeline for emergency managers, I first want to point out the decision making thresholds that emergency managers use to determine key actions leading up to a tropical cyclone threat. All emergency managers shared, for instance, that their timelines are built around when they first anticipate impacts, not landfall. They also have specific timelines in their hurricane emergency plans, although there is so much variation across threats that there are still many complex decisions to be made. But beginning with phase 1, beyond 5 days, emergency managers are monitoring disturbances at the start of hurricane season. If there seems to be a threat or something that could form, they will be paying closer attention to that. Similar to broadcast meteorologists, emergency managers will be starting conversations with staff and key external partners about the threat, which varies depending on the level of governance they are operating, and they will develop situational awareness with staff to ensure everyone is on the same page about what their roles are. Depending on the threat or storm, they will begin pushing out public awareness campaigns via social media or through their respective web pages. And communication with the public, this communication with the public continues and ramps up throughout the duration of the threat. In phase 2, for emergency managers, the period between 5 days, roughly 5 days to 48 hours from impacts, is an incredibly busy time where key decisions are made around evacuation and the logistics that entails. At this point, they may have activated or will partially activate the Emergency Operations Center. They will have increased communication and coordination with key partners, decision makers, and others, such as surrounding counties or states, to coordinate evacuation. Importantly, emergency managers shared 2 separate timeframes for evacuation. First, based on the general population, which they plan to have evacuated prior to arrival of impacts, and at-risk or access and functional needs evacuations, which can occur as early as 72 hours out from impacts and require significant pre-planning and expenditures on resources even further in advance. This includes hospital evacuations and evacuations for those that do not have the means or ability to evacuate. During this point, and especially as they get closer to 48 hours out, they may begin considering where to stage resources for response, such as sandbags and routes for rescue. All the while, they continue to push information out to the public at higher frequency, especially considering that evacuation notifications, whether voluntary or mandatory, will be going out at this point in time. And in phase 3, in this final time frame, while they continue to closely monitor the arrival of impacts such as wind, storm surge, and/or rainfall, the EOC is also likely fully activated depending on the storm, and evacuations should be complete or very quickly wrapping up. Key decisions and actions have already been made. As a couple of emergency managers mentioned to us, it's over at 48 hours. They will be following the NWS and National Hurricane Center for any changes in intensity and impacts, anything that would affect their current plans, such as resource staging, shelters of last resort, and search and rescue. The safety of staff and first responders are prioritized, so they will work to ensure that responders are in a safe place at the time of impacts. This is communicated to the public beforehand in cases where people may not have left, and that they let the public know that emergency responders may be unable to reach them. Emergency managers use information primarily to make decisions to help protect the public. So their timeline is driven by both availability of information and how far in advance decisions must be made. Similar to broadcast meteorologists, earlier on they turn to what's available from official sources, but they will still seek information elsewhere or rely on experience or instinct to make decisions earlier on in the time frame, often before official impact information is received. Importantly, and also similar to the broadcast meteorologists interviewed, emergency managers shared that they deferred to the National Hurricane Center and NWS, the information that's released by these official sources when making decisions. Several emergency managers shared that while the products listed here, such as the cone of uncertainty and impact-specific products, are useful, they still relied on that person-to-person contact with local NWS offices or the FEMA Hurricane Liaison Team to interpret forecasts. So many of the products shown here were used in conjunction with one another in order for them to interpret or make decisions. And again, while we don't have time today to dig into each of these products individually, we wanted to provide an overview of the types of information each group used along the timeline leading up to a tropical cyclone threat. And here we wanted to present examples of emerging information gaps. And I just wanted to reiterate that these are preliminary and that they will be further informed by the survey. So we're in the process of exploring these themes once we are able to receive that data. Generally, both groups find much of the information provided by the National Weather Service to be very useful. However, in some cases, for both groups, there seems to be a mismatch between available information and their decisions and actions in different ways. So although interviewees recognize the uncertainties in forecasts and the challenges in providing information earlier, most said that some information earlier is better than no information. For broadcast meteorologists that predominantly operate along an information dissemination timeline, interviewees mentioned issues regarding the timing of official information releases. For instance, the timing of official NWS information releases sometimes do not align with when they need to go on air. Emergency managers, on the other hand, predominantly operate along a timeline for making public safety decisions, which often require a complex set of pre-decisions leading up to evacuations, for example. So they discuss situations in which they use forecast or warning information to justify rather than to make decisions because the information wasn't available before they needed to make said decisions. And finally, emerging findings showed the need to localize information whenever and wherever possible. Some also mentioned that, some interviewees mentioned that while the NHC Key Messages product is helpful, they suggested including similar high-level takeaways into other graphics. And in addition to this, the Key Messages product tends to focus on the regions that are expected to be impacted the most or the soonest, and the partners in other regions have to look to other products to find similar information for their areas. Because many of the decisions that the partners and members of the public must make are based on anticipated impacts in their area, geographically specific information about potential impacts is useful when possible, although interviewees recognize the inherent uncertainties. As discussed earlier, however, when localized information can't be provided, some information is better than no information. And in these situations, some of the interviewees talked in terms of considering and communicating different scenarios. And with that, I will turn it over to Anne to discuss the survey research.
Thank you, Jamie. Next slide, please. So the second phase of data collection includes online surveys with broadcast meteorologists and emergency managers. The goal of the online survey disseminated to broadcast meteorologists and emergency managers this year is to broaden our sample beyond the 20 interviewees so that we can develop more generalizable findings for the evaluation. As you can see, we have the same project goals, and this validation goal is an essential part of what we're doing with the survey research. And we ultimately hope to combine the interview findings with the survey findings to develop our research-guided recommendations to NOAA on improving the tropical cyclone product suite. We fielded the broadcast meteorologist survey in March and April of this year, and we are now in the process of fielding the emergency manager survey. And so I'm just going to present very preliminary results from the broadcast meteorologist survey. Next slide. Here I'm showing the structure of the survey instrument itself. We included both open and closed-ended questions asking about types of information as well as specific products and tools, about their use and assessment of these, as well as their ideas for improvements. And in every single part of the survey, we're building very closely on the interview results, as you'll see. So you'll see echoes of the interview contents that Jamie just presented a second ago. The first block of the survey introduced the survey and asked for informed consent. We asked people about their jobs and their roles at work so we could identify what specific tasks they're doing and if they align with the kinds of decision timelines and tasks that we saw in the interviews. In the second block, we asked about this first phase, as Jamie introduced, more than 5 days before a storm impacts your area. And we asked open-ended questions initially and then some closed-ended questions subsequently about specific types of information. In the third block, we asked about the subsequent phase, 5 days to 48 hours before a storm impacts your area, with a parallel structure to what we asked in the first block of questions. In the fourth block, then we ask about 48 hours through impacts, and that also has a similar parallel structure to block 3. The fifth block was an all phases block that asked questions across all phases of the tropical cyclone threat from the time a potential threat is identified through impacts. And we asked a variety of questions in this section, including open-ended questions as well as more specific questions, echoing the interview findings to see if we could confirm or validate or extend any of those findings. And the last block then finally was demographics so that we could identify our respondents. So preliminary findings. Thank you, Rebecca. As you can see here, about a third of the sample identified themselves as chief meteorologists. And we see that everybody, a majority were meteorologists of some sort or other in terms of being a weather anchor, a primary weather anchor. Very few identified themselves as producers. We had a total of 87 complete respondents who were broadcast meteorologists from the continental US Atlantic region who completed the survey. The sample was shared graciously with us by Ed Maybach, who is director of the George Mason University's Center for Climate Change Communication, which they developed for their Weather Matters program. And I'd be happy to talk more about the sampling and response rates later if there are questions. As you can see here also, these are quite experienced broadcast meteorologists with an average of over 20 years working as broadcast meteorologists and almost 20 years working as broadcast meteorologists in regions affected by tropical cyclones. The range here was quite large. We had a minimum of 1 year of experience up to a maximum of 48 years of experience working as a broadcast meteorologist in this region. Next, please. So for the open-ended questions in the second 3 blocks, we asked people first, how helpful to you are the information tools that the National Weather Service provides in the phase? And as you can see here, the overwhelming response is that people find this information extremely or very helpful. We have over 75% saying extremely or very helpful for this specific question. And then we asked them, in responding to that question, which information came to mind. We got a variety of responses for this first phase, which is more than 5 days before impacts. But commonly, people mentioned the cone of uncertainty and predicted storm track coming to mind first. The first thing that here are a couple of quotes that follow. The first thing I read is a synopsis on the storm, and I look at the storm track. After that, I read about the possible impacts in our area. With that information, I set about putting together the best graphics to relay the information to my audience. Honestly, at 5 days out, I will take anything they give me. We are all watching the models, and anything I can put into a graphic or map is gold. The tropical outlook graphic is what comes to mind first. Next slide. These got flipped around somehow or other. How helpful would it be to you if NWS provided additional information or tools during this phase? And here we have more than 5 days before impacts. And as you can see, there's not as much agreement that this would be extremely helpful, partially because people feel there's so much good information provided already. So a more even distribution of the responses. And people's suggestions included quite a few types of products that we saw mentioned in the interviews. For example, a forecast cone that's a little farther out. Same with the TWO. Localized impacts in different scenarios. So this is very much echoing what we saw in the interviews. And we heard satisfaction with the information that's already provided. The information 5 days out is pretty comprehensive already. It's quite helpful. For me, a first look at affected tides or surge is important as far out as we can get. Living in South Florida, we have very flood-prone areas during king tides or abnormally high tide cycles. Tropical cyclones just make it that much worse. If we can get a heads up on impacted tide times or issues with storm surge earlier than we do now, we can begin focusing on the extremely important impacts that brings to our area and bringing a larger evacuation timeframe, as well as forecasting road closures due to this rise in water. So you can see that people gave us quite a variety of suggestions. This is just a sample of some of the kinds of information that they listed more than 5 days out. And that is the time frame in which we saw the most recommendations as well. Next. For the subsequent period of approximately 5 days to 48 hours, here we see even greater satisfaction with the information that's already provided by the National Weather Service. We have virtually everybody saying that that information is extremely helpful or very helpful. When asked what information people were thinking of, the responses included often this kind of response. Obviously, it's the forecast cone along with the discussions that come along with the forecast. But we saw some other responses as well. Leading up to 2 days before landfall, we began to focus on our local AFDs heavily, as well as first look at NHC graphical forecast for the area. Hurricane threat and impacts graphics also become available around the 2-day point, allowing us to start fine-tuning our impacts to our local area. I also began relying heavily on the excessive rainfall forecasts, especially for slow-moving storms. So we see here again this emphasis on localization. Impacts timing and track starts to become more certain now, confidence increases, and our communication changes to adapt. When we asked them what additional information they would like to see and how helpful they would find that. Here we see also that they would like to see more information, not as quite an overwhelming response that everything that it would be extremely helpful, but a little bit more in terms of finding new types of information to provide. And people mentioned things like nothing specific comes to mind. Our local office does a phenomenal job with very detailed impact information, perhaps more of a heads up when certain products are issued. So this is this timing issue that Jamie mentioned. Anything that can provide a time of arrival for perhaps the strongest winds would be great. We already have time of arrival graphics from the National Hurricane Center for the first onslaught of the winds, but if we can fine tune that graphic to show a region-specific highest wind threat timing, that it would be really helpful. Also, any graphics that are region-specific to excessive rainfall would be very helpful. Impacts by county, timing of impacts arriving and departing. So you can see here, even in these few excerpted quotes, that there are themes that we're seeing echoed from the interviews, and we're seeing the detail in their open-ended responses on the surveys for those. Next slide, please. So I'm going to provide an example here from some of the types of closed-ended questions that we asked. So starting first with more than 5 days before impact, how important do you think it is to communicate the following about tropical cyclone threats to your audiences during this phase? And you see a list of types of information. And at the top here, deemed most important in the 5 days before, more than 5 days before impacts time phase, we see forecast uncertainty and the importance of paying attention to the threat. This shifts then when we go to the next phase, which is 5 days to 48 hours before impacts, where you see that people think it's more important to communicate forecasts of the storm track, but forecast of the potential storm impacts, and forecasts of storm intensity. So as are more important as the importance of paying attention to the threat. And then we go to 48 hours through impacts, and we see highlights here of the storm impacts, forecast of storm intensity, and again, the importance of paying attention to the threat. One thing that we don't see highlighted as much as we might have expected, given that it came up occasionally in some of the interviews, is how forecasts agree or disagree. They don't think it's important to communicate that relative to the importance of these other topics. Next slide, please. And we asked a few questions about this issue of adapting current products. So when communicating with my audiences about tropical cyclone threats, National Weather Service graphics, and we have a variety of possible responses here. Meet my communication needs as is. I use them to communicate as is. Meet most of my communication needs. I sometimes modify them to communicate better with my audiences. And this is the modal response from the broadcast meteorologist. And we see few people, we see no one saying that they're not useful and that they don't use them. We see almost no one saying they're not useful as is. I have to modify them to communicate with my audiences. So we can see from this reaffirmment that that most of the broadcast meteorologists are modifying the products that they're getting, some at least. So next steps, we are launching the Emergency Manager Survey this week. This is similar to the Broadcast Meteorologist Survey, but it's shorter, both to accommodate their COVID-related time constraints and also to try to up the response rate so we can get more diverse responses from the emergency managers who we know are rather time-pressed in their jobs. We are also going to complete this analysis of survey data. We will be looking at integrating also those findings across interviews and surveys to synthesize those key information gaps and show what we've learned from both forms of research, and to collaborate with NOAA ongoing to develop and refine recommendations for improvements to the tropical cyclone product suite, both on the shorter and longer term. Thank you. And here's our contact information. And also, while he's not listed here, Nick Haji-Michael, who's been working with me, can also be contacted through me.
All right, thank you to Jamie and Anne for your presentation. We do have some questions here. So the first question is, how large was your research team?
Jamie, do you want to take that?
Sure. So we had 5 members of the research team represented from the National Center for Atmospheric Research and 2 at the University of Washington. And that's on the second slide. I'm not sure, Rebecca, if you can go back to that, but we have our team listed there. and as well as our NOAA collaborators, of course. But in terms of the project team, there were 7 total team members. Are 7 total team members.
I'd like to reiterate that we worked extremely closely with NOAA and the team that was mentioned initially on this project, and have bounced ideas off them several times in the course of developing the interview and the survey guide in particular. They've been extremely helpful.
All right, the next question is, this seems to suggest that broadcast meteorologists use in-house models in final 48 hours as the primary source for NWP.
I'd be happy to take a stab at that, but and then I'll let Jamie try it. But I didn't show any of that data here, but I'm guessing from what we've seen in the survey data that that's not entirely true. In fact, in-house models weren't deemed as important as other sources of information.
All right. Regarding the broadcast meteorologists, point taken regarding time to get the info prior to the broadcast cycle. Is there a solution for this?
Well, I'm hesitant to say, and please also feel free, Rebecca, to jump in, because Rebecca and I and other members of the team have been working very closely with, have been working closely together to analyze the data. So, but I will say that it seems as though, I mean, oh, I apologize, my computer's kind of messing up here. I can't see my screen anymore. But I wanted to go back really quickly to the note that Anne mentioned, because I think it's kind of related, but in terms of displaying the models in terms of in-house modeling, I think many times when it was mentioned in interviews among broadcast meteorologists that they were more so using their own in-house equipment to make the forecast more localized and to also make it a bit more clear to their audience, and that'll of course differ from region to region. But Rebecca, if you'd like to jump in as well, I'd appreciate that.
Yeah, so we are still going back to some of these details in the interview data. I think here it's not just the numerical models, it's the analysis systems, and really they talked about in the last phase, it's that they don't use the NWP models as much because there's all the other products. So it's not that these things are emphasized, but that it's more that the NWP models are less prevalent. And then, as Jamie mentioned, it's a lot of observations, bringing the information together, figuring out how to display it for localized impacts, those kinds of things. The question that was just asked, and I'm totally forgetting it, I'm sorry. If someone reminds
Sure,
me.
I can repeat the last one for you.
Thanks.
Regarding the broadcast meteorologists, the question is point taken regarding the time to get the info prior to the broadcast cycle. Is there a solution for this?
Yeah, so we've been discussing this, and other people have heard this over the years. We've heard this ourselves from our research, and some of the broadcast meteorologists do have specific suggestions, but this is a place where we're going to look at what they had to say in more depth, and analyze that with our other knowledge and discuss with NOAA to see if there are suggestions that are possible. There are some places where broadcast meteorologists suggested things like they recognize that the forecaster's timeline is also crunched, but maybe there are places where there can be something provided a little bit early so that they at least have time to digest it, or something where they can know what's coming, or just something like that. And it depends on really what's practical on the NOAA end. But I think this is an issue that's been identified for a while, and it's a matter of thinking in more depth about what can be done about it. But we do have some specific suggestions from the broadcasters, and the question is just whether or not those are feasible, or whether NOAA can adapt those to make them feasible.
And we have just begun analyzing the open-ended survey data from the open-ended responses from the survey data, and there are suggestions as well, as you saw, including things like, well, just as Rebecca mentioned, a heads up on when products might be coming out. That might be helpful to the broadcasters.
Okay, next question. Is there a reason you started with broadcast meteorologists first, then emergency managers?
So we did the interviews simultaneously. With the survey, we had initially planned to do the survey much earlier and to implement it in parallel, but we delayed the survey because of COVID, because we knew especially emergency managers just had no time. And so we decided to phase it with the broadcast meteorologist first, so that we could gather information from that and use it to focus the emergency manager survey as much as possible, because so that we could make it shorter and learn from the broadcast meteorologist survey to make the emergency manager survey as short as possible, given how busy they are, and especially how everyone is both busy and pretty burnt out after a year plus of COVID. And we did work with members of the emergency management community as well as NOAA, and did pretest to discuss with emergency managers specifically how we could try to get the best response rate possible given the constraints. And one way was to really ask for as little time as possible.
There's another more pragmatic aspect of this too, is that as I mentioned, the broadcast meteorologist sample came from George Mason University, who very graciously shared this. It took them years to put the sampling frame together. The emergency emergency manager's sampling frame was constructed de novo, and Nick deserves a lot of thanks for helping us put this together. Also, Castle and others from NOAA helped with providing sources for this, but it's been a huge amount of work to put the sampling frame together.
All right, for both broadcast meteorologist surveys, was there a difference between the use of graphics and the use of the legacy text products?
So we did ask questions about that, but we have not looked at those data closely yet. There's some complexity because we wanted to keep the survey short. We didn't ask everyone all the same questions, so that's something we're still looking at. I will say from what we know from the interviews and the brief look we've taken so far at the survey data, as well as other research, the graphics are definitely important, and they use graphics very heavily in communicating with their audiences, but they also use the text products. And we just haven't looked in enough depth yet to see across the broadcast meteorologists if there's a quantitative difference in the different phases, but the text products are still useful to them in being able to scan things quickly, key highlights, seeing the most important changes, all those kinds of things.
And we do see variation in their use of the text products. Some they like better than others.
All right, did the broadcast meteorologists detail how they changed the products in order to explain things easier to their audiences?
Yes, so some did go into detail about that, and in some cases it was a matter of maybe using different phrases to explain the threat level. And again, I don't want to say that this was a theme across interviews, but this is an example of how a couple of broadcast meteorologists changed the products. But it was really just they tried to not only localize it, but used different terms or phrases to try to explain the level of risk. And so they didn't necessarily go into detail about what that entailed, but that could include not only changing the text and changing how they describe the threat, but even colors, maybe colors associated with the threat. There was a couple that mentioned that they did that. So not really, again, not a theme across the interview data among broadcast meteorologists, but those are just a few examples of what we mean by that.
And I'll add from the survey, based on the preliminary analysis we've done so far, one interesting thing is that in the open-ended responses, and this echoes what we saw in the interviews, is that for some, they say improving that NWS graphics is really important because that would allow them to just quickly use them. And others say, listen, we're going to modify them anyway because my management wants me to have something, unique. And so there's not full agreement on that. We did also ask in the survey some specific reasons why they had to modify the products. Based on what we heard in the interviews. We actually didn't end up getting a lot of data on that just because of how we asked the question, and they didn't talk as much about needing to modify the specific products we asked about, but we do have that data, and there are definitely themes in the open-ended responses and that we saw in the interviews, and that we and others have found in prior research, such as the legends being really complicated, the terminology being complicated, the importance of simplicity and things that people can grasp quickly, some misunderstandings about certain kinds of information. And so we're analyzing all that data in more detail, as well as with the broadcast meteorologists. We have some that are in coastal regions, some that are more inland. We have, more bigger markets, smaller markets. And so we anticipate that some of the responses will vary according to that as well.
All right, beyond the need for more emphasis on localized impacts and the decision timeline, are you seeing any major gaps in the current tropical cyclone products themselves, any product needs or changes?
And I welcome, Jamie and Anne to jump in here. That's where we're still synthesizing the results. We did synthesize some results from the interviews, and then we asked about some specific kinds of improvements in the broadcast meteorologist and emergency management survey. We had, I think, 9 different kinds of improvements that we identified and then worked on with NOAA and asked them which things they thought would be most useful. We need to analyze that data in more depth because we anticipate, for example, that people who are inland will not say that better storm surge information is important to the extent that people in coastal regions are. So we haven't analyzed it in enough depth yet, and we also want to wait for the emergency manager data. But yeah, I think there are issues which I think NOAA has already identified. If you've seen the previous webinars in this series about being able to find the information that, especially if you're in an inland location, it can be all different places to be able to compile the information. Information about updates, broadcast meteorologists in the interviews expressed interest in getting more information from the Weather Service to be able to know in advance when information is being updated or what the key changes are so they can prepare, so they have more than 5 or 10 minutes to really focus on the key highlights. So there are these sort of meta types of information that people are interested in beyond improvements to specific products, as well as comments, for example, about things that have been known for a long time, that the cone, people don't understand it very well. People don't understand storm surge information, and some suggestions about that. But a lot of those are things that NOAA is already aware of and has been working on. So we're trying to work in conjunction with them. And we're also trying to focus on, some things that could be done over the short term, but also things that could be done over the longer term where more research might be needed to be able to provide the information. And it's not possible yet based on, predictive skill, but that there can be more focus on research and research to operations. And some of those things are things that NOAA has already identified, for example, track and intensity forecasts, or more information about track and intensity more than 5 days out, storm surge information earlier. Things that NOAA has already identified, but by looking across the data, we're hoping to prioritize some of these things and then confirm some of the things NOAA is already working on and identify if there are additional gaps that have not been identified. So those are some examples, but we want to be cautious to not finalize our recommendations before we really had a chance to analyze the survey data, especially the emergency managers.
Okay, how did you come to determine the codes and subcodes that you used?
I think, Jamie, that's a great question for you to answer.
Oh, of course. Yeah, that's a great question. So the codebook was initially crafted in part, it was based on the interview guide itself. So the questions that we had constructed for that guide were then translated into codes, so to speak. So when we asked about, I had questions about the decision and action timeline, we then created a code for decision and action timeline. And then that was broken out into the 3 timelines that we presented. But it wasn't just based on the interview guide. It was also driven by the data itself, by what we were finding in the interview data and also on prior literature. So if I can, yeah, do you have this slide up, Rebecca? Maybe we can just go back to that. But if there's anything else you want to add, that's how it was put together. And we also talked through the coding scheme with our internal team and discuss it with NOAA as well. So it was an iterative process.
And Jamie brings a lot of expertise in, disaster management and working with different kinds of partners who are working on emergency management and response systems. And then I bring expertise on that specifically in the tropical cyclone context, and have done previous research looking at these groups' information decisions and use of information, as well as other groups in the weather context. And so really we were the 2 main people that worked on the code book, and Jamie did most of the data analysis, but we worked on it together. as well as with our team. And so we really brought our expertise together. So I think the coding scheme is really a product of our interdisciplinary expertise and our different perspectives on the situation coming together. And Jamie had done relevant work but hadn't specifically worked with tropical cyclone forecast information use with these groups. So we had these complementary perspectives that came together along with those of the other members of our research team and knowledge about what NOAA was looking for to be able to develop a coding scheme that combined those different forms of knowledge.
Really excellent point, Rebecca. Thank you.
All right, and we have a follow-up. Was there anything you noticed was missing after the initial data review that was then added to the codebook in terms of something that was unexpected in the data?
I think there were definitely things that we added. I'm trying to think of examples offhand right now, and I can't think of one. Maybe Jamie can. I'm not sure if there's anything that was unexpected, but there were things that we hadn't put in there that that developed. I think one thing that I hadn't thought about as much was, even though it's not a major part of their job, or the most important thing maybe for NOAA to think about, is how much, as Jamie mentioned, they focus on, they make internal decisions about staffing and public safety and how they use the forecast information a lot for those kinds of things that are probably less thought about than communicating with the public, evacuation decisions, and so on. So that ended up being something that we added to the coding scheme that we didn't have from our prior work. Jamie, do you have an example to add?
That's a great point. And I wish I was wanting to pull up the code book just to have it all in full in front of me right now. But something else that, again, I wouldn't say it was surprising, but we spent a lot of time also discussing the external factors that played into evacuation decision making, aside from forecast information and other forms of information they received in order to make decisions. So that could include, for example, political and social factors, past experiences with storms. But that was really fascinating to dig into in more detail, and I look forward to teasing that apart a bit more. But what do you feel the same way about that, Rebecca? I thought that was really interesting how all of those various socio-political factors came into play as well.
Yeah, I think those are things that we know about that happen, but we really got some rich data to interpret that with our interviewees, who were really enthusiastic about telling us all the things that they do.
All right, that is all of our questions. So we can wrap up here. Thank you to our speakers. Thank you all for joining us. You'll be able to find this presentation on YouTube later this afternoon. When the presentation ends, you will see a survey. If you could take the time to fill that out, we do use those surveys to improve marketing our library seminar service and to inform future seminar topics. Thank you all for joining us. Have a safe and enjoyable rest of your day.